All right, cool. So welcome everybody. What I'm going to be doing today is walking through an Express server and adding some sort of error handling to it. I'm thinking about what are the different parts in our system which can fail, and thinking about how we can handle situations where things don't work out. So I'm going to be using the contact snapshot app as a reference starting point, and so I've cloned the repo and called it error handling. So if you, oops. So it's pretty much the same files, right? So I'm going to start by looking at the routes file, right? So let's say, so this is pretty much the same routes that we have. So we have a home page and we have some contact routes, right? So if I start this app, and go to localhost 3000, I have a list of contacts here in my database. So I'm going to simulate something that breaks, right? So I'm going to create a fake route. And I'm just going to throw an error. Right, so if I do this, and then I go to the /test route, I'm going to get a badge like this stack trace here, right, with the same message that I'm throwing. And this could happen in different points of your app, right? So imagine that this route was making a database request, and the server went down and tried to connect to the server, but it threw and cannot connect to the server error. Right, so these error messages can vary based on the kinds of errors that happen in your application. Sometimes SQL, you may send SQL something that SQL doesn't like, and that will break SQL, right? Like, let's say there was a typo in a query that would cause a different error. So there's all kinds of errors which happen, and the idea is that you want to protect your user experience from exposing stack traces. Instead, you want to like handle it gracefully and inform, like have some sort of a log somewhere which says that this is an error that occurred at this time, and have enough information for somebody to go back and look at the logs to figure out how I can prevent this from happening in the future, right? So, so if we look at what we want, so some of the requirements are: don't expose stack traces to the end user, right? This is one of the most important things. Log, I guess, enough information for a developer to be able to debug in the future. And then, what else? Yeah, I guess we can start with these two right now. Okay, so if we were to not, so how would we handle this situation? Any ideas? Yeah, Sally.
You like create a new error and then like pass it to next to something, and then have like an error handling.
So there's right. So it's possible to add an error handling middleware. And where should I add the error handling middleware?
It should be after everything, right? Yeah. It should be after all your SWs and routes or anything else.
Okay, so this file is the file that is being called by server.js. So this is, so anything at the end here is the end, right? So I can add it at the end here if I want it to be at the end. So I could say router.use. Oops. So you're saying error middleware, right? So response or request, response, here I could say response.send. Something, right? So I can do this. So how would this middleware be triggered? So I have a middleware which handles an error, right? Which takes in an error. How would I trigger this middleware? Okay, and who has to call next?
/test.
So this function. Okay, and what does next need? It needs error, but do we have a handle on the error here? So how do we get a handle on the error?
You just like create a new error instead of throwing it, and then like send that error they created next.
Okay, but so imagine. Okay, so how about this? So let's say.
Well, that's what we
Actually, just copy this here.
Yeah.
All right. So this is usually how your code may look, right? Like you have some sort of a function which does something, right? Like var a equal to this, and then maybe you would say response.send a or something, right? But a is throwing an error, right? So how would I trigger my error handler? Because if I do this right now, oh, it actually got triggered. But I explicitly want to trigger it. Like I want to know exactly when it would get called. So what would I have to do? Like how do I get a handle on the error? Because I may want to do something with the error. I may want to like log the error stack or log the error message. How do I get a handle on the error? Okay. So how do at what point do I use try catch?
Within the function.
Okay.
The line 16 try catch.
Okay. So I said try. And then I have a catch. So I have a handle on the error now. So here, now I can do some stuff, right? I can say console log, error is e dot stack, and then I can call next with e. And then I need to make sure that it says next here. Right, so now I have some finer control over how I want to like go to my middleware, my error middleware.
Do you always have to have a try in order to use catch?
Yes.
Okay. Then with promises and our routes, like especially for promises, it's .then and then .catch. So is there a try automatically?
So for promises, it's different. You don't need a try for promises.
Okay.
But so that gives you a function called .catch that you can call on a promise chain.
Okay. Got it.
But if you're using just this catch thing, it cannot exist without a try block. Okay, so now when I refresh, I also get a stack trace and I get back a message here. Right, so now I have two things. So usually what people do is they console error the error, because console logs are usually reserved for like things when good things are happening. Like you don't want your good place to have like errors. So that way, if something bad happens, the user can just go to the error log to see all of the errors that have happened. Yeah. Done.
Real quick, how do you prevent a client from seeing this stack trace?
By sending a different response.
Okay.
right? So when you send a response, you're sending exactly what you want.
All right.
So at this point, I can send something different. I could create like a. Have you ever seen the Twitter fail whale page?
Yeah.
When it used to happen when they grew like super quickly, and they used to crash all the time because they couldn't handle the load. Twitter. So this was the original one, where the whale is too heavy. Or like this. As you can see, Twitter is overcapacity. Yeah. So this is basically extractor is happening behind the scenes because the server is just not responding, right? But then they're showing a message which is much nicer.
Thank you.
All right. So what's that? Yeah.
So for the error middleware, like the first parameter we usually expect it to be request, and the second parameter to be response. But over there, the first parameter is error, second and third are response. What's happening there? Isn't it usually like the order of the parameter?
Yeah. So whenever the so the way it figures it out is if there are 4 arguments, then it assumes that the first argument is the error parameter.
So if I left out next, then
if you left out next, it would get confused. It would think error is actually request is actually response, and response is next. Because these are just names, right? They're not really these are names that you're referring to, which is why you have to provide the next, even though I'm not really using it.
Well, I thought next was reserved. So you couldn't change it to like some other word. It has to be next, right?
No, it's just a parameter. You can call it whatever you want. What is the synonym for next? Like after? Yeah, you can say after too if you want. Cool. So, okay. So one refactoring that we can do here is we can create a middleware named file, right? So we can create a file called middlewares.js, and we can move this function in there. And I can just say this is error handler. Right, and then here I could just say router.use middlewares.error handler. And then I have to import middlewares. Right, so this kind of looks much nicer now, where it's just like, oh, I just use this middleware error handler. I can also do another thing, which is more fun, which is log errors. Right, which is I want to like console dot error, my error, and then I'm just going to call next of error. And then I'm going to say router.use middlewares.log errors. So now all my errors get logged. So I don't explicitly have to do this thing now. So whenever an error happens, it will automatically get logged. So did people look at the link that I sent out?
Yep.
What was it?
So I was wondering, in your log errors, you have a console.error. Would it, because in the example I saw, it was console.error stack. Is there a particular preference?
Yeah, I guess error stack is fine too. I think if you log error, it will automatically call a toString on it.
Okay.
But let's see what's the difference. So. Router.use requires middleware functions. So what is not a middleware function? Oh. Yeah, I think it still logs.
It still logs the stack.
But you can be more explicit about it.
Oh.
And then we don't really need this anymore. So. So here we get like the stack trace. So sometimes you may want to kind of not just return a response here. You may want to like send back like an actual HTML page, right? So you may want to send like some sort of a you may have an EGS file, like a Twitter whale, right? So you just create like an error. So you have your views, and I created like a page here which just has like some image.
Nice.
Right. So instead of giving back that oops, it would just render this. So that's up to you, right? Like what you want to do with and how you want to display the error. Yeah, question.
So you don't have to do the try catch anywhere when you merge it to the middleware?
Yeah, I don't have to do the try catch.
Oh, okay.
So let's look at like DB contacts here, right? So let's say something is wrong with the query to get the contacts. So let's introduce an error into our query. So let's go into DB contacts. So it's calling get contacts. So let's say we have a typo in the query, right? So this is now going to throw in an error. So let's see when you go to our home page, what happens. So we get this back. And the error is something that we did not expect, which is it's trying to render a page with contacts being undefined. So that's so it's trying to call response.render with contacts. And then because we have a try-catch block here, we are returning an error back. So ideally, we shouldn't be doing this. Yeah, I need to fix this code here. So instead, what needs to happen is we just throw the error. So we throw the error, and the error gets propagated here. So you get a better error instead of getting this. This error is just indicating that it's trying to render contacts, right? It's trying to render this index page, and contacts here is undefined. And it's trying to call for each on an undefined. Right? And that's the error. But the actual error was the fact that something was wrong with the query. Right? This is just a consequence of the query being broken. So we want to go down to the root of the problem, which is the query being broken. So the stack trace should always indicate the real problem. So what this was doing is it was swallowing the error here. When I'm doing a dot catch and I'm just returning the error, actual error is just being swallowed. Because the original error was because of this query being incorrect. But because I have a catch block, it's just swallowing it and it's not really doing anything. Instead, if I were to have logged it here, right? So let's say, let's fix this. So instead of just returning the error, so let's say I will return the error, but then I also say console.error, error.stack. If I do this, now we'll get 2 errors, or at least 2 logs. So the first one, here you go, right? So the first one was contact doesn't exist, and then the second type error is that I tried to render a page which did not exist, or rather, the page which had an error.
See the code again?
So I changed this part.
Oh, just to make the error more clear to if the error happens.
Right. So we shouldn't be returning an error. We should be like rethrowing the error. Yeah. This is probably better.
Why?
Because Because what's the point of returning an error?
It's almost as if your goal is to get an error, right? If you're trying to return something as opposed to throw it, right?
Right. So when you're throwing an error, it's basically saying it's saying that I'm throwing like a hot charcoal piece at you, right? It's like, here, catch this thing, and now you have to handle it in a certain way. Whereas if I just return the error, it's just an object which has some properties in it. So
so how does the when you reload the page, how does the error in stack trace look now? Is it any different?
When I throw the error?
Well, you showed us the page where there were two errors on it.
Right. So that was the case when I was returning an error, right? So because I was console logging the error,
yeah,
as well as returning the error.
Okay.
So if I throw the error, now I'm going to still get two stack traces because the first one is going to happen because of this thing,
yeah,
and then the second one is going to happen because of my log middleware, my log error middleware, right?
Yeah,
so
right. I just want to see what it looks like. Does it look any different from?
So what do you think is going to happen? Now that I'm going to throw the error. Any guesses?
It'll look the same because when you throw the error, it'll go to the error handling middleware.
So same as what?
It'll like console that error, and then when it gets to the middleware, it'll console this next error.
So when you say that, you mean the error for the query, or do you mean the error for the context? So there's two different errors here, right? The first error was the query being incorrect, and then the second error was that it was trying to call for each on something that did not have for each defined.
Oh, maybe it'll
So it
just
doesn't
do
even
the
try
first
that
one.
anymore. It doesn't go that far. It only throws the first one.
Okay.
So it'll just
That's
throw
what
the
it's
first
not.
one?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. So it still did it twice, but yes, it was the same error twice.
Okay.
Because we were catching the error here, and then they were rethrowing the same error.
So you don't need that console error.
Exactly. So we don't need it anymore because we have a. So I mean, there's sometimes we do. Sometimes we do need these this catch. So there are situations where you want to give enough information to a developer to say what happened. Right now, in my stack trace, I'm only seeing the stack trace. Right? I'm not seeing any information about what were the arguments passed to that query. What were some additional things, metadata or meta information that I can give the person looking at the stack trace to help them figure out why something broke. Right? So sometimes it may so happen that so this one doesn't really take any arguments, but let's say like this query, right? Somebody passed in some crazy contact ID which caused an error. And it was a weird error, and there's no way I could figure that out without actually having the contact ID. So what I may want to do is I would want to say console.error, get contact query failed. Very good. Let's choose that. Something like this. Right? I could do this, and then I will rethrow the error. Okay. So I'm getting another console error here, but this error is going to give me additional information that will help me debug this error. So let's say this was get contact, right? So let's say this was another bug. Let's fix this. Right, so now I go here, and And oh, you know what may happen is something unexpected, which was because I'm using router.use in middleware, this contacts doesn't have those middlewares added to it. So these may need to happen somewhere else. So this route, contact/5, right, is defined inside this contacts file, right, which is a separate file. And I'm attaching the middleware to this router. And so the middleware, these middlewares aren't being added to the routes inside of this file because it's defined on a separate router.
If you put it above it, would it work?
No, it wouldn't work either.
It has to throw the error before that makes.
Right, and it's still technically using a different router.
Yeah, so I think.
Can you put it as a type of middleware where you put it in the as an argument in the function?
Yeah, so the usually what I've seen is also another thing is like you pass in app as an argument to this function. So instead of just exporting a router, we export a function which takes an app as an argument. So you can say function module.export equal to function app. And then you don't need to create a new router here. And you don't need this. And this router will take app as an argument.
Wow.
Got undefined router.use.
So we have to add.
What line is that? Server 18. Oh yeah, I need to return router. Okay. So because this was not returning anything, so when I call this function, this was being undefined. We're still doing something. Cyclic proto value. Wow.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Something has a cyclic.
Oh, what happened? So on line 6 in the file on the right, using router.get on. But doesn't app.use append that slash already to everything that's in?
Right. So this would just be the home route, like just the local slash route.
So the app.use on line 18 on the left, does that append another slash?
Oh no. Good question, but yeah. So what could this be? I wonder, so this is taking a single argument and is returning a router. Any ideas, folks?
Or the console log router on line 6.
Yeah.
Or 5.5.
So it's a function, and so if I console log okay, both of them are the same things. All right, so maybe this is something that I can try to fix later, but what I can also do is move these two middlewares, which are like global middlewares, to this here. And then this could also be a middleware, actually. All right. So this no longer is a function. Okay, so let's try that. Cannot find middleware, so server. Do not read property apply of undefined. 921. Oh. This is text. So still getting a stack trace. Going back to our query. We're catching. Let's go into our route. So view, sorry, server.
Table of contact. That's a T. It should be throwing an error, right?
Which one?
Get contact.
Right, but I was expecting my page to be rendered and not the stack trace. So I think it's probably because this thing is doing something fun here. So when I call this function, I have a catch here. Oh, that's the problem. I don't need a catch anymore. It's unhandled promise. So I guess my catch should actually just call next of error instead of doing my render error. All right, so there you go. That was a problem. I wonder if that was a problem from the beginning.
It might have been.
So I may have misinformed you. So let's try moving that back. So if we move these two things back into my routes index, Let's see. Okay, that worked. My bad. I lied. So actually that's better because now I can move all of these middlewares into this file. And my server file just looks much cleaner. Right, so I just have this one line to initialize my routes. And even this can be a middleware actually. So this could go in the beginning of my routes file.
What's response?
What's response.locals? So response.locals is an object that's used by the view engine, so whatever view engine you're using, and makes those values available in the view. So if I set response.locals.name, I can use the name variable in my view file. So whenever you do something like response.render, and then you pass in an object with like name is something like this. This is nothing but providing response.locals to your view file. But when you set it explicitly before, that's just creating like the default values. And whatever you pass in here are going to get merged with those values. So if there's so if you set locals.name equal to Helen, but then if I at some point in the later thing I do response.render, but then I set name to something else, whatever is set at the future point will be overridden. So it won't. So Helen is sort of the default value if it's not provided, but this I can provide an overridden value too. Yeah.
If we use response.locals in a view file, so how would we access that in EGS file?
Just by the so I could just access name. Yeah, like I don't have to say response.locals.name. So response.locals is automatically available, will automatically be resolved in the view. So if you say something like address, and if it doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error because response.locals object did not contain a property called address. So something like set default once locals. And then here, I could just do it in my index file, right in the beginning. So I could say router.use. Oops. Right, so all of my middlewares and routes are in this one file. So nothing on my server file will contain anything about middlewares and routes. It's just going to be initialization, which is this one time here. And things should still work. Let's go.
So can we go back to where you're doing the catch? Because I thought that what we decided on was that we didn't need a catch in the database functions as long as we had the middleware to handle it later. But now it seems like you do need to call next here.
Oh, you're talking about the routes file, or you're talking about the database function? So there's two places, right? So let's look at both. So there's this routes file, right, which eventually calls the database function. Right, so ignore these two lines. So I'm calling this DB contacts, which returns a promise, right, which is why I have to say .then, because it's a promise. And if I get back a contact, then I do some stuff. Otherwise, I catch the error and then I call next with the error. So then, and that's hoping that somewhere down the line there's an error handler.
Okay.
But also in my database function, which is my DB contacts function, sometimes I may want to do my own logging, right? Which is like, oh, what are the arguments which were passed to my function, and some sort of better messaging that can indicate like which function threw the error. So like at this point, it's like, oh, the get contact query failed, because otherwise, when my stack trace before was just something like, some sort of error happened, right? Like this was the stack trace, pretty much. Error contact does not exist. It doesn't really tell me which query triggered that error. But right now, with my custom message, I can be like, oh yeah, the message is query failed. I have my stack trace here, and then I have my arguments too.
So for that one's for getting a specific contact,
Mm-hmm.
and we want it to be special.
Mm-hmm.
For the function that's just getting all contacts, right now it's just error.stack. Could we just get rid of that catch and the error will
but
all the way through?
Yeah, we could, but I think it's still a good idea to have a custom thing here, just because it will, this is like get contacts query failed. It may not have any arguments because it doesn't really need any arguments, but this would be much nicer too. It's just like standard practice to be like, when you have a function which can fail, it's always good to log the metadata about the failure condition. Yeah, sorry.
If you're consoling the error there, do you need to have the other middleware that consoles the error, or is that for like other things that may not console the error?
Yeah, that's just like a default thing that happens. That's fine too. So one error can end up logging like 2 or 3 times, and that's fine too. Like more information when something fails is much better than having no information.
Another question.
Yeah.
For the middlewares for both errors and the not found, I'm used to seeing res.status and set the status. Do we need to do that explicitly or not, since you're not? Is it like automatically set it?
Or for the not found?
Yeah, I'm used to seeing
Right. Yeah, that's
that's
fine.
And the same for the errors. I'm used to seeing like res.status. I think it's error.status or 500.
Yeah.
Do you need to?
Yeah, we should. Totally. I missed that. Thank you. Because I think right now the status code was not 500. So let's undo what I did actually. Or maybe by default Express sets it to 500. No, it's a 3 or 4. So let's change it back to 100. Cool. Now it's a 500.
It helps. It helps with my understanding sometimes.
Any other questions, folks?
Caching is relatively new. I was just reading about that.
Yeah, Thomas.
I saw that in the source code, there's a module where you render an error and you use two responses as per parameters. And I'm just kind of wondering why, I've just never seen that.
You're talking about, yeah, that was like because error handling was not thought about when writing this piece of code. Yeah, I would. So are you talking about isn't utils?
Yeah.
Right. So this is kind of like you have to explicitly call this function in each of the places where an error happens, right? So like here. But instead, if you just call next of error, that's exactly the same thing.
Oh,
You see what I mean?
Would go to the middleware then.
Right. It would trigger the error handler middleware. When you pass it, when you call next with an error, that trigger. So it's kind of like this, right? So instead of doing that, I can just do this. So I don't even need to know what is the error handler downstream. I can just assume that somebody smart has written this thing and has thought about handling an error, and then there's a way to do that. It's kind of like an abstraction. Like I'm just like, go downstream, and here is the error, and somebody downstream will catch the error.
Okay, that makes sense.
So you shouldn't be doing these things anymore. So this should just be the next of error. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Same thing here.
How does that work when it's response?
Which one? Here? Yeah. So because this is like a fake error handler in a sense, it's not like the middleware error handler. You're explicitly passing in the 3 arguments here, right? So you just call it. It's not really doing the express way of finding the next function. And explicitly calling the function that you want to call. How's everyone doing? Does this make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful.
A little.
Yeah, I think it'd be really cool for us to do like just a project on error handling, like creating custom error handlers and like all that cool stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when Salon did that? He created like a custom error handler or something like that for a project. It was really cool.
Okay, it's a good idea.
I think it would be cool to know like what being in error handling is also on Express.
Baked in error handling?
Yeah, like remember you're trying to trigger the track ads, but it triggered it before the track ads. You're on it. So something that's part of Express already does some level of error handling.
Yeah. So I think if you include error handler, that's automatically going to get triggered. So but that's only going to happen if it's not in the asynchronous chain, right? Because when you're doing a promise, it's going in a different sort of code of execution. The default error handler is not going to get triggered. So an example is, so this, when I say app.use error handler, it's basically saying all the errors which get thrown, synchronous errors which get thrown will get caught here. But any asynchronous error will not get caught because that's happening on a different chain of operation. But if I call next of that within the scope of that function, of that asynchronous function, then it'll get called. So let's try to give that with an example, a concrete example. So going back to our so router.use. That's the error. Request response next. So if I do this, what would happen? So if I go to /localhost 3000/error, what would happen? An error would get thrown? For sure. But then what would the experience be on the browser? Would I get a stack trace? Would I get the Donald Trump page? What is that?
I think you would get
Stack trace?
Stack trace. Because you need to context with the error door.
All right, so let's see. I get a Donald Trump face. And why is that? Because it was a synchronous error, it got caught by the error handler. So now let's try doing an asynchronous error. How do we execute throw an asynchronous error? Okay. So let's start after a second, and let's put this in the function. All right. So now, what do you think is going to happen after 1,000 milliseconds?
It's going to go back to Trump's
Wait, it must be a function. Isn't it a function?
Yeah.
Isn't the syntax of first argument is the callback?
Oh, I see.
Second argument is the-
Thank you. That makes sense. I was like, all of my thing was not working there. Okay, cool. So it crashed.
Yeah.
Your server crashed. Why did it crash? Because it was an unhandled exception which is thrown. So because it was an asynchronous error, the default error handler did not get triggered. And the only way to trigger the default error handler when it's asynchronous is when you explicitly call next of error. So inside of this, I will have to have a try
and catch.
It's looking pretty ugly here. What is happening? Oh, there's 1,000 here. Catch or ERR. And here I would say next of ERR. And I still need to close.
1,000.
All right. Now what's going to happen?
I should go back to Trump's ugly face. So scary, Tom. So scary. So big. So big.
Okay. So questions about this. Does this make sense? The difference between synchronous and asynchronous errors?
I never even considered that.
Yeah, I've never considered that.
Yeah, that actually explains a lot of why I'm confused. I'm like, why does this happen? But it doesn't. Oh, because they're different.
So I guess like the moral of the story is to always like try and break things and see what happens. Like just play around with your code. Be like, oh, what if I introduce a bug here? How does my app behave if there's a syntax error here? If there's like something wrong in this place? It's like you're introducing chaos into your system. Yeah, and then there's some companies like Netflix, which I love to give an example of. They introduce chaos into their live production, infrastructure, where they just take down a data center, and they'll be like, "Oh, let's see what happens." That's all. This is introduction. When millions of people are watching Netflix, they just take down a bunch of computers. Yes. So they have these tools called Chaos Monkey, Chaos Kong. So Chaos Monkey takes down computers, Chaos Kong takes down data centers. And data centers are like these large, like hundreds and thousands of computers. And they're located like on different parts of the world. So like America has like, I think 3 data. So they are hosted on Amazon, AWS. This was because in 2012, they were only hosted in one data center. And that data center went down. So Netflix was down for like a good day and a half. That's like millions of dollars of lost revenue. So then they decided that this is never going to happen again. Then we're going to test and see if data centers go down, what happens to our system. And the only way to do that is to actually do it in production, because nobody can really simulate the load of Netflix by having a few people to use Netflix. Yeah, so it's like crazy things that can happen, but like to begin, you have to always start with your own app, right? Which is introduce some chaos into your application. Cool. That's all I had.
Thank you.
I've watched that a couple times.
Yeah.